Thank you very much, Lloyd, and thank you all for being here at the end of a busy conference when there are so many other delights that you can pursue in the most habitable city in the world, which is Melbourne. Let us, if only for a nanosecond, pause to reflect upon the injustices that have been done in Australia to the Indigenous people. I acknowledge the elders and the youngsters of the Indigenous people, both of this area in our continental country, but also everywhere in the country. And I acknowledge all minorities and the pain, disadvantage, including economic disadvantage that they suffer. In 2012, I was a member of a commission of the United Nations Development Agency, and that commission was called the Global Commission on AIDS. Ever since the advent of the AIDS epidemic, I've been involved with national and international activities to respond to the epidemic. And the report of the Global Commission on AIDS addressed what it saw as the impediments to successful strategies against HIV and AIDS. And there was one chapter which addressed the impediment that was created by the unequal laws and social policies against LGBTIQ people, and the way the laws and attitudes made it difficult for people to get access to healthcare and to make a fuss when they didn't have access to healthcare. And another chapter was addressed to the impediment that the law presented more generally to access to medicines. And that chapter, chapter 6 of the report, was in a way, probably in the view of many, the most boring chapter, because it dealt with very technical legal issues, but it was also, in a way, the biggest problem that faced humanity in tackling HIV, and as it happens, tackling malaria, tackling hepatitis C, tackling other contagious diseases and non-contagious diseases. And this was the policy incoherence between the universal human right to access to essential healthcare and the intellectual property rights that exist to protect the interests of inventors of new health technologies, pharmaceuticals and other technologies, and promise that inventors will get rewards for sharing their inventions with society. It is out of that second area of the law that the law of intellectual property is developed, and that includes the intellectual property called patents, the protection, the monopoly protection that is given to inventors for sharing their invention with society. They get a monopoly for a period of time, usually 20 years, and that monopoly is what's the trade-off for their sharing it. I remember that when I was a young boy at school in Australia, just after the Second World War, I received a copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, one article deals with the right to health, and another article deals with the right to benefit from the advances of science and the obligation to share the benefits of science with society, contributing thereby to the right to health, but the entitlement of those who do that to get rewards for doing so. And so In the report of the Global Commission on HIV and the Law, we pointed out that a number of developments had happened in the 20 years before that report, which moved against the entitlement of people to get access to healthcare because of developments protecting and enlarging the right of inventors to have rewards by way of patents. And we recommended that the Secretary General of the United Nations should establish a commission which would look at this problem and come up with solutions that would protect the international community and both of those aspects of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which had never been really worked out in a way that was harmonious to each of them. And the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, took a time to deal with it, because to say that this was a hot potato in the international community would be an understatement. This was an issue in which very powerful interests in the pharmaceutical industry and other industries didn't want to have any changes in the United Nations that would alter the current arrangements, whereby essentially those who invent get rewards, big rewards, and there's not much that can be done about it by the poorer countries of the world or even by the richer countries of the world. But just before he left office, Ban Ki-moon established a high-level panel for the purpose of looking at these policy incoherences, and I was appointed to the high-level panel, and in fact I was appointed the chair of the technical advisory group that was advising the members of the panel. The co-chairs of the panel, as is a common United Nations practice, were two heads of government. The former head of government of Botswana, Festus Mogae, and the former head of government of the Swiss Confederation, Ruth Dreyfus. And those two, with 12 members of the panel and a technical advisory group of about the same number, met, had public hearings in London, Johannesburg, and links to Bangkok, and developed its report and came up with the report by the end of 2016. And that report recommended a number of changes in the international treatment of access to healthcare. That was at the end of 2016. Urgency was injected into the matter by the decision of the General Assembly of the United Nations late in 2015 to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. The Sustainable Development Goals, 17 in number, set out the objectives of the United Nations that were considered essential to advancing the development objectives of the United Nations, because without economic and social development, you're not going to get the advancements in society that are essential for the matters that were dealt with in the 17 goals, including the right to health. The right to health was dealt with in the third of the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 3. And the right to health is divided into a number of subcategories, and they deal very substantially with the very big impediments in developing countries in terms of infant mortality and mortality in the first 5 years of life, and tropical diseases and other diseases in the developing world that needed more attention. But SDG 3.8 was a very particular and in some ways the most ambitious of the goals that was embraced by the General Assembly. And that effectively committed the United Nations, no matter where in the world, no matter the ages of the people, to the principle that by 2030 everyone everywhere would have access to essential medicines. And essential medicines were not defined, but that doesn't mean they didn't have a meaning. Essential connotes something that is really important either for the life of the person or for their welfare and happiness, so that the intolerable life becomes the tolerable life, or if not, a happy life. So when the high-level panel got to work, we had to work within the constraints and within the purposes of the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly SDG number 3.8. And we had on our group people who were very much involved in the industry of pharmaceuticals. Sir Andrew Whitty, who was the chief executive of GSK, was there, and Maria Freire, who was an extremely important person in NIH, people who knew how the current system works, and pointed out with fairness two things. First, that the current system has delivered remarkable developments in pharmaceuticals, in vaccines and in other health care, and therefore, so it was said, you have to be very careful when you tinker with it. And second, that the international community had to take steps that were respectful of the economic interests, and anything that didn't respect economic interests would end up being counterproductive, and that we had to be very careful of that. There were other members of the high-level panel who came from civil society, and they were, naturally enough, very keen to make sure that we did what we could do, given that these high-level panels are rare, and even this one took a lot of energy to get it on the tracks, and therefore that we should seize the opportunity and do what we could to advance the two goals, and especially the health goal, and especially SDG 3.8. And so at the end of less than a year of deliberation, we were under a constraint because Ban Ki-moon was about to leave office, and we wanted to get the report in whilst he was still in office so that he could set in train the steps to follow up the report, and that we did. The report was divided between the core recommendations we could all agree on and the entitlement of members to say we were going too far or we weren't going too far enough. Naturally, a couple of members said we were going too far and we should be very careful about going too far. Others said we didn't go far enough and seize the opportunity to take a blow for right to health. However, the essential recommendations were that the international community, who most of whose members are members of the World Trade Organization, a trade organization which is not an agency of the United Nations, but which decides matters that are important for intellectual property law, should stop bullying other countries to give away the flexibilities that were promised in the so-called TRIPS agreement, the agreement on trade in intellectual property that had been adopted in 1995, and that the provisions in a Doha Declaration of 2001 should be respected to permit countries, when they have a national health crisis, to declare a crisis, and where necessary to give a compulsory license for the production of an essential drug, so that that can be produced outside the patent regime cheaper for them than would be otherwise the case. There was an example before everybody which was up front, and that was the example of HIV, When HIV came along, there were effectively no drugs which made a great deal of difference. And then they began to find some old cancer drugs that seemed to have a benefit in slowing down the operation of HIV. And then by 1995, they found that by combining a number of these old antiretrovirals, they could really palliate the HIV, not cure it, not rid it from the body, but make a huge difference. And if you were around at that time, you saw this miracle that was worked on your friends who were living with HIV, that suddenly they began to feel well again. Suddenly they could go back to work. But at the time, the drugs cost $10,000 a year per person. And if that were the cost, then obviously that would not be a feasible proposition in the developing countries. And so in India and Brazil, they began to, by reverse engineering, develop the antiretroviral drugs as generics, cheaper versions of the same drug. And the consequence of that was that they began to have drugs available for people in poorer countries. The price plummeted, both the price of the generics and also the price of the original drugs, and went down within a space of months to $100 a year, and then even further down as it became feasible. And of course, then it became available to developing countries. And now, at this moment, there are 19 million people in the least developing countries who have access to these essential drugs. And there would be about another 16 million people who could be advantaged if they could have access to it. So that AIDS was in a sense the paradigm, and the example was placed before us. In our report we made a number of recommendations, including that countries of the nations that have the intellectual property should stop bullying the poorer countries, and that the world should engage in a treaty that would gain the capital for the purpose of making the development of drugs, pharmaceuticals and other technologies suitable for the whole planet, not just for the rich countries, and cheap enough that the poorer countries could have access to them. So that is the proposal that is now before the international community. The former Director General of WHO, Margaret Chan of Hong Kong, was not very enthusiastic for the recommendations in the report. However, the new Director General of WHO, who is himself from a developing country, has shown much more interest in the recommendations, and this is simply a matter of unfolding news, and it is a very important issue, and hopefully it will be responded to. Now, the final thing I want to say is another existential and international issue, and that is LGBTIQ rights. In the international community, a new expert has been established by the Human Rights Council on LGBTIQ rights. We should not think just because we've had our little problems in Australia in the last few weeks that this is an issue only for Australia. This is an issue for the world. Drugs, pharmaceutical drugs are an issue for the world, but so is the issue of LGBTIQ rights. And it's very important that in Australia, as we address the issue of equality and an end to discrimination against people, that we will also be concerned with the issue of LGBTIQ rights in other countries, because in many countries of the world the situation is quite dire, dangerous, and even fatal to people who happen to be gay. So that's essentially what I came to tell you, and I hope you will be engaged with both issues, including with the issue of gay rights and gay equality, because the situation we've arrived at is a terrible affront to gay people in this country, and many of them will feel very anxious about their situation. That's not good for their liberties as citizens, but it's also not good for their health. And I hope that everybody in this room will be very conscious of that and supportive of equality for everyone in this country, no exceptions. No exceptions on the ground of race, no exceptions on the ground of religion, no exceptions on the ground of gender, and no exceptions on the ground of sexual orientation or gender diversity.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kirby, for your presentation, and I think we've got just a few minutes for questions. I'll ask people who have questions to send them through on the Twitter, because we won't have roving mics for this session. I might start with a question, because you obviously talked at length about the issue of rights, and we've really focused our discussions this weekend on issues of justice. I opened the session talking about environmental justice, social justice, and obviously this is something that's close to your heart, and it's a main principle of global health about equal access and reducing health equities. But how do you balance, and how did your panel balance the universal right to health versus the actual resources available? I mean, in many of the countries where people in the audience live and work, they actually simply can't meet those goals of universal access because of resource constraints. I mean, how did your panel balance that?
First of all, it's important to recognise that the Charter of the United Nations of 1945 sets 3 goals for the organisation. Number 1 is universal human rights. Number 2 is universal peace and security. And number 3 is justice. And the justice goal is often not referred to, but it's absolutely at the core of the United Nations. It's true that the resources of many countries is not great. And one argument put by those who said leave well alone was that there were many things that countries could themselves do to make drugs that are out of patent available in their own countries, but that they don't do. And that there is some truth in that. But obviously, if the price is going to be $10,000, the numbers of people who will get access to an antiretroviral treatment in the case of HIV or equivalent treatments in other diseases will be much smaller. And the amount of investment that will be put in the investing decisions of entrepreneurs is going to be addressed, as it substantially is at the moment, to what are the needs of developed countries and sometimes needs such as face creams and other non-essential pharmaceuticals rather than the diseases of the poorer countries, including river blindness and so on.
Yeah, you obviously have worked on AIDS treatment. The antiretrovirals you described as a miracle, and indeed miracles in global health don't happen too often, but I think the development of antiretrovirals can be described that way. And in fact, the AIDS treatment movement is one of the great success stories of global health. But as you said, neglected tropical disease, TB, malaria, perhaps less successful. What do you think was the kind of secret to the success of the AIDS treatment movement versus other big issues in global health?
I think one of the reasons certainly was that there were very active civil society organisations pressing the international community. Most people who got HIV were not gay, but there was a significant cohort in the United States of America, Australia, the United Kingdom and so on who were, and they were very active, and they had organisations like Get Up and organisations which didn't accept that they were just going to die. And I think that led to a lot of noise, and that led also to the development of India and Brazil as big pharmaceutical really pharmacies for the world. And so that required a combination of civil society activism, but also local laws that could be used in order to ensure that the drugs could be made and would be developed to address the problems of the poorer countries. And so they were, in a sense, beneficiaries. But as I said earlier, 16 million people could benefit from access to antiretrovirals at the moment. So AIDS was a success story, but it's not a perfect success story.
We've got a question coming through on Twitter. Last night, Richard Di Natale argued that to minimise corporate influence on government, we need campaign finance reform and a corporate corruption ombudsman. What is our political, legal, social movement recipe to get these?
Well, I don't want to comment on those two initiatives. That's something that would have to be sorted out. One of the initiatives we urged was that every step in providing for intellectual property should be subject to a criterion of its public health impact. There should be a public health impact criterion of the provision of intellectual property protections. But for other things, we have to get people more interested in these issues. They tend to be seen as very technical issues. Even amongst lawyers, intellectual property law is seen as a very technical specialist area. But it's not really. It's giving people a monopoly, and they can use that monopoly for a long time, and then they can, in some cases, be guilty of evergreening their product so that the pill turns into the potion and then gets another 20 years of protection. And if you go to the United States, you sit there and you see every hour there are advertisements for drugs. And the United States public health system is shambolic. And the market simply doesn't deliver the best health care. And you need a mixture of the market and inventiveness, but also an effective public health system. And we have a reasonable public health system, though it does tend to fall down on the equity issue, but most countries of the world do not, and the United States is near the bottom of the list of Western public health systems.
Got a question coming through on the app about judicial activism. In a recent episode of The Policy Shop, retired Supreme Court Justice Tony Fitzgerald commented that Australia's structure and separation of powers limits the ability for judicial activism. To help solve problems related to access to medicines, do we need to restructure the way that our judicial system interacts with government legislation?
Well, judicial activism is something, it tends to be an insult word. Sir Anthony Mason, a great Chief Justice of Australia, when asked about judicial activism, turned to the books that were behind him and said, "Where do you think all those decisions came from?" They came from judges who were active. They were making decisions. They were dealing with new problems. So it's in the eye of the beholder. I thought that the High Court's decision upholding work choices, which turned on its head 100 years of precedence, was judicial activism by my colleagues. They, no doubt, thought that some of my decisions were judicial activism. It just depends on where you stand in the spectrum of values and what you regard as essential and available within the decisions that the judges have to make. As to changing the basic structure of our Constitution, I don't see that happening, certainly not in my lifetime, and I hate to say this, Lloyd, but not in yours either. And therefore, what we have to do is to consider very carefully the appointments to the highest courts and to recognise that judges of the highest courts inevitably give effect to values. It's just in the nature of deciding between the alternatives which are available to them. And you can't escape that, and if you pretend there are complete value-free zones in the law, well, you're just not right.
Victoria and the ACT are the only Australian states that have a Charter of Human Rights. Does Australia need a Bill of Rights to address social inequities?
Yes.
And how do we get one?
Well, we have to convince the politicians, and that presents the difficulty. The politicians who run the country come from two main political camps, the Labor Party and the coalition parties. If you actually look at the number of members of the Australian population who are members of those parties, they are significantly fewer than a Melbourne football club. And therefore, a relatively small number of citizens decide who will be the candidates, and in particular the candidates in the outer suburbs of Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, who make the difference in governments with elections. And therefore, if you actually analyse the number of people who decide our politicians, it's a mythology to think that they're chosen by the great mass of the population. They're chosen by relatively small numbers of committed people. And how do we change that? Well, we change it by people getting involved in politics, taking it seriously and realising that politics affects all of us, and it affects the dignity and rights of all of us. I feel insulted by what has happened. I'm a citizen of this country, I've held constitutional offices, and yet my country has imposed as an obstacle to equality in the provision of marriage a hurdle that has to be jumped of an unscientific, non-binding postal survey. And nothing could be done by the High Court, so the justices held, and therefore that shows the primitive nature of the Australian Constitution. We have no equality provision, and I think it's about time we got one.
And indeed, the treatment of refugees seeking asylum and protection in Australia has been one of the darkest chapters in our history. We have a question here coming through.
Yes, but you can also add to that the way we've treated women in the law, the way we've treated non-Caucasian people in the era of White Australia. Would White Australia have passed a postal survey? Don't think so. We would still have the White Australia if there had been a postal survey on that score. The way we make laws generally in Australia is in Parliament, and that's a good and protective mechanism for correct examination of issues and not just sheer street prejudice.
I think that that's a fantastic way to finish this discussion. Thank you so much for joining us.